going to be your closing contributions, all of you. So what I'm going to do is put a question to specific individuals, but also ask you to make your sort of closing thoughts. And we'll start with you, Malik. Pick up that last one about the problem. You've brilliantly deconstructed for us what's going on inside, but some of the sort of geopolitics of this isn't actually just a Syria issue.
No.
There's dimensions all the way around, and perhaps, I think what was behind that question, a sense that those dimensions make it even harder to act or to solve this. And this is your closing thought.
Yeah. What's happening in Syria isn't just purely Syrian. It's got obviously geostrategic dimensions. The funny thing is, before Hafez al-Assad became president in 1970, or before the Ba'ath Party coup in 63, Syria was very much a political football between countries, neighboring countries that were more powerful than Syria: Iraq, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and also the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. What Hafez al-Assad was successful in doing is stopping all these neighboring countries and superpowers fighting their little turf wars inside Syria. When the revolution began, what happened is the people of Syria have allowed Turkey and even countries like Jordan, which didn't have any sort of involvement in Syria, to have some sort of involvement. Obviously the United States and Russia as well. So now what we are witnessing in Syria is a tug of war between two axes. One is a Western-led axis with Saudi Arabia and Qatar kind of taking center stage, and another one between Russia, Iran and China on the other hand. And if it wasn't for this tug of war, probably Bashar al-Assad would have fallen a long time ago. So even if Bashar al-Assad falls, Syria will continue to be a center where there will be regional and international proxy wars, if you like, not necessarily military, but certainly political.
Thank you. Roger, your column in the paper is called Globalist. You take this sort of geopolitical view. Given the stakes that people have, Iran in particular doesn't want this kind of vacuum on its doorstep. Does that make it, yes, certainly more difficult, but almost impossible for there to be action on this?
Well, I think Iran, very specifically, does not want the Assad regime to fall because it's Iran's sole real strong ally left in the Middle East. I think the Arab Spring has been very negative for Iran. Nobody's talking about Iranian-style theocracy in Tunis or Cairo or anywhere else. I think we do have all the potential for a proxy war in Syria, and to some degree it's already begun. And how it plays out, I don't know how long it will take, but I'm certain of this. I don't think Syria can be an exception to the trend we've seen throughout the region. What we're witnessing in the Arab world, I think, is comparable to what happened in Latin America in the 1980s, in Europe in the 1990s. And Arabs are basically saying, enough. We are not going to be ruled by these Paleolithic characters who seem to think that our countries belong to them. And I think Michael said the genie's out the bottle. It is in Syria, and I think it's going to be difficult, bloody, but at the end the Assad regime will be gone, and some compact will emerge between Syrians. Perhaps Iraq can play a useful role. I mean, after all, Iraq has had agonizingly to wrestle with many of the issues confronting Syria today, and it's interesting that the Arab League, as we speak, is convening in Iraq for the first time in a very long time. Could it be that Iraq, and perhaps also flipping things around, Lebanon, which interestingly has been among the calmest countries through the Arab Spring? Why? Because it is actually a much more open country than many others were in the region. Perhaps Iraq and Lebanon can eventually serve as in an instructive way.
Thank you. A closing thought from you, Rana Kabani.
I'm afraid I don't share that rosy view of Iraq or Lebanon being able to play useful role in Syria simply because both Lebanon and Iraq are very much controlled by Iran at the moment. We've heard Maliki's outrageous.
I would question that.
Well, yeah, okay. Let me have my say.
You'll have to question it afterwards. Go on, run.
We've had Nouri al-Maliki's outrageous support for Bashar al-Assad, even though he did hold the Baghdad conference there, and we've had Hezbollah's outrageous support for Assad, which has led to Hassan Nasrallah being one of the most reviled people in Syria after having been one of the heroes to the Syrian population. And Iran has played a role in Syria that was very much one that leads us to where we are today. Hafiz Assad, when he went against the Arab consensus and stood by Iran in the first Gulf War, was doing something that we see the consequences of today. Now, we all speak about Hafiz Assad's crimes and his brother Rifat Assad's crimes. What we don't know is the third brother, Jamil Assad, who was instrumental in forging this symbiotic relationship between the sectarian Assad regime and Iran.
It's very interesting, new elements introduced there. Paul, I want to put to you the question that came from the back there about the rumour that only 40% of the army is being used and there's the rest there still in barracks, cut off without communications, they don't know everything that's gone on so far, ready to be unleashed. Did you pick up any sense of that, and also just a closing thought?
I mean, that's something that we were told very early on in the first days of going to Syria, that they kept them separated in the barracks, they kept the phones off, they didn't allow them Al Jazeera, Sky TV. I believe to a point that's true. I believe at this point in time now they're a very demoralised army. They've seen a lot of losses, not only from Free Syrian Army combat, but also from the security services who do actually shoot the army if they don't attack when and how they're told. As for numbers, 40%, I just can't verify. It's not something I can do. As a closing statement, I was in Misrata for 2 months. I saw the Libyan people, what happened to them under Gaddafi. Essentially, the genie was out the bottle. Gaddafi was never going to put them people back under the cosh. I think the same has happened in Syria. They won't put the lid back on what has happened. I think it's inevitable that some form of intervention, arming, is going to take place. I don't think it'll be solved diplomatically, and I think the longer we leave it, the more people will die, and it's just a matter of how long we're all capable of sitting back and watching the death rate raise.
Thank you. I'm going to skip over to Michael Weiss because I want to, in deference to your thought, Nadim is going to get the last word tonight, but I'm going to put to you, Michael Weiss, the question about Turkey and what role there might be for Turkey in all of this.
I think if there's any sort of military intervention, as has been discussed tonight, Turkey will take the lead role for reasons both geographic and political. It's been, as I mentioned, threatening to impose, or promising to impose, depending on your perspective, a buffer zone in northwestern Syria since June, when it first began to absorb refugees. It was one of the first massacres of the revolution in Jisr al-Shugur. We've noticed in the last few weeks that Turkey has slightly modified or recalibrated its messaging that I would call more pro-intervention. The Prime Minister last week explicitly invoked the right to protect doctrine, which is the first time he or any member of the ruling Turkish establishment has done that. The problem with Turkey, of course, is, and this is something we haven't discussed at all, the Syrian Kurdish population. The Syrian Kurds represent the largest minority in Syria, probably the largest minority, between 10 and 15%. Now, if you know anything about Turkey's foreign policy, it is all run through the prism of its Kurdish question. There are more than 20 million Kurds living in Turkey. Erdogan is very worried that if, say, the Syrian Kurds were to get a sort of semi-autonomous region, as though they have in Iraq, in Syria, this would inflame Turkish Kurdish opinion. So let me be the first to say, evidence against interest, Turkey intervening militarily in Syria is not without its own complications. It's a very fraught policy. There are also there's a sectarian component as well. Those refugees pouring across the border into Turkey, most of them are Sunnis, except in the Hatay province where they're being held, there's a large Alevi population. The Turkish Alevis are another Shia sect. They tend to be more pro-Assad. It's already creating sectarian tensions within Turkey to have this giant refugee population. If it were to explode to the numbers that the Red Crescent anticipates, 500,000, you're going to see the bleed over of the Syrian sectarian question into Turkish
Turkey.
territory.
Thank you. And I'm going, as I said, in deference to the point made about the complexion of the panel, Nadim Nasser, the last word to you, and include in it, if you could, the answer to the question that came from the audience there, that given where we are now, is it, given that people are dying, is it not just too late to talk about dialogue?
One of the problems we have not touched is religious extremism. There is one of the biggest problems in Syria, inside Syria at the moment, is fear. I heard a lot of resentment from Malik against minorities. But we have to take into consideration there is enormous fear inside Syria because there is a fear that Islamic fundamentalists and extremists will jump to power. This fear is true and real, and especially for the minorities. And the dialogue, when I'm saying the dialogue, I want just to comment that it's not going to Geneva to have a cup of coffee, and it is not also to have a dialogue for the Assad to reform. I'm not talking about either or. I'm talking about an international conference which brings the whole political spectrum and including the regime on the round table so that we spare and save lives. All what I'm saying is every single life in Syria counts and every drop of blood counts. And I lived in Beirut and I know the horror of the civil war and the military intervention because it happened in Lebanon. Every military in the world came into Lebanon to help the Lebanese through the army. And Iraq is the same, Afghanistan is the same, and all military intervention caused more trouble and more bloodshed. We want peace and we want harmony in Syria. And the last sentence I say, the richness of and the uniqueness of this country is the diversity.
Thank you. We're at the very last stage, which we're just going to do that little vote just to see if people have changed their minds. 4 options now, in deference to Nadim: do nothing, military intervention, arming the rebels, and the international conference and dialogue. So we'll go through them first. So those who think the West's best position is to do nothing. 1 or 2, a few hands, 3 or 5 or 6. Second one is to arm the rebels, arm the opposition groups, levelling the playing field, as we heard there. That's quite a few. I'm not going to put a figure on it, but you saw it. Full-scale military intervention of the kind advocated there, many more than there were before. And lastly, that call for an international conference. So quite a few takers for that. And maybe some of you voted for several options.
Well, I'm not the only one here. I'm equal 20.
Don't all get up yet. Don't all get up yet. Please just stay, because I'm sure you're going to want to join me in, first of all, agreeing that whatever the complexion of views on the panel, a great deal of expertise assembled here. I certainly learnt a lot. Please thank